If you have questions or suggestions for future podcasts, please submit them in the comment section below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. How fiscal policy harms the poor. Hi, I'm Dave Arnott, the Christian Economist. Hi, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Well, that sarcastic anecdote serves as an introduction to today's podcast, because where the government is supposed to help the poor, there are 5 ways in which it harms the poor. All 5 violate the scriptural command found in 1 Timothy 5:18, which states, "The worker deserves his wages." In the Amplified Bible, there's an additional comment at the end there that says, "He deserves fair compensation." The scripture is repeated from Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Inflation. When the government has a fiscal policy of spending more money than it's taking in, the Fed is forced to adopt a monetary policy of printing more dollars to cover the debt. This is called monetizing the debt. When you increase the supply of money, each dollar is worth less, and that's called inflation. Inflation harms the poor more than the rich. Now, you would think that inflation harms those who have more dollars, but the rich have financial advisors who move their assets into investments that rise along with inflation, so they're not hurt. Now, also, the rich can delay the purchase of big cars and yachts and vacations, while the poor must buy milk and diapers on the daily market, so the poor are harmed more by inflation. So, government-induced inflation violates the fair compensation command from 1 Timothy. The worker is paid in deflated dollars that don't buy what's fair for the recipient. Now, think about it. When any government representative or bureaucrat says they support the poor, they're doing it with other people's money. And as Margaret Thatcher wisely observed, eventually you run out of other people's money. My addition to that quip is, people run out of their own money because it won't buy what it used to. Minimum wage. Now, minimum wage is one of the few things that cause both of the evils of macroeconomics: inflation, which I just explained, and unemployment, which comes next. I know it seems nice to pay people more, but when you pay more for the same level of production, you cause more of that nasty stuff I just talked about, inflation. And you violate the commandment about paying fair wages, because you're paying a wage that is not fairly determined. Government reports incomes in quintiles. Maybe that's because there are 5 fingers on one hand. Okay, minimum wage is supposed to help the lowest paid folks in the bottom 20%, but it doesn't, for 2 reasons. Explained by Thomas McCurdy, who is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. His article in the Wall Street Journal is titled, "The Minimum Wage Stealth Tax on the Poor." He reports that minimum wage workers are dispersed throughout the 5 income quintiles. Huh? Well, he's right, because income is not measured by the individual, it's measured by families. So here's an example. If one of my Dallas Baptist University students belongs to a wealthy family, but the young man coached soccer at his church league this summer at minimum wage, his income is taken back to his rich family where it gets reported. The aforementioned Professor McCurdy says that minimum wage workers are not concentrated in that bottom quintile, but they are equally spread throughout the 5 quintiles. I know, I had to read that 3 times the first time I saw it also, but it seems to be accurate. Thus, increases in minimum wage helps the rich. Oh, and what about minimum wage supporting children? Well, McCurdy reports data showing that only 5% of minimum wage workers are supporting children. Now, if you pay labor a higher wage, the products and services they produce cost more. Now, if you could somehow pay higher minimum wages to the poor and have the products and services they produce be purchased by the rich, you might enjoy some effective wealth distribution. But sorry, it doesn't work that way. Let's just consider McDonald's hamburger for a minute. If minimum wage increased and you could guarantee that all the burgers were bought by the rich folks, that'd be good. Sorry, it's actually the reverse. Poor people buy more minimum wage produced goods than do the rich. So you give them a raise, then you charge them more for the goods they buy. It's a vicious cycle. Oh, and by the way, how then should we enrich the poor? Well, make them more productive. I've often said that policies that promote production is the only thing that separates rich from poor nations. When the poor are more productive, they can be paid more without causing that previously mentioned evil of macroeconomics, inflation. So, is the Christian Economist a mean guy who wants no minimum wage? Well, actually, that was called for in an article in the New York Times on January 14, 1987. It seems that the biblical view from 1 Timothy is to pay a fair wage. Fair is often described as an environment where everyone gets a vote. In economics, we call that the equilibrium wage, where everyone demanding and supplying a job express their view about the correct wage. When all the votes are tallied, it produces the equilibrium wage. Unemployment benefits. People respond to incentives. That's why one of the first books in economics was titled Human Action, and it was written by Ludwig von Mises. If you pay people not to work, as the government did during the pandemic, they won't work. When you stop rewarding sloth, people will go back to work. Unemployment benefits harm the poor because they keep people out of the workforce where they have the opportunity to learn new skills and increase the value of their economic output. As I stared at this subtitle, Unemployment Benefits, I began to wonder, what are the employment benefits? Here's one answer. Andy Puzder was President Trump's nominee for Labor Secretary. He makes the interesting point that we gain much more from work than just the monetary rewards. Workers learn how to perform a skill, how to get along with others, and how to please customers, and, maybe most important, how to please a boss. Now, one of President Joe Biden's favorite quips is as follows. My father used to say,
Joey, a job's about a lot more than a paycheck.
Then why does the president support giving people only a paycheck for not working? Yeah, that clearly violates the command from 1 Timothy that we've referred to pay the worker his wages. Paying wages to someone who does not work violates that edict. Stephen Moore, writing in the Epoch Times, points out, quote, President Joe Biden eviscerated all work requirements during COVID-19 and they haven't returned. Why? Do they want to make people dependent on the government? End quote. Now, the phrase work is good is one of the 10 biblical commandments of economics found in the book Biblical Economic Policy that I co-authored with Sergei Seidamatov. Now, getting welfare recipients back into the labor force is good for the economy. It is also good for the poor because it helps them escape welfare dependency. Now, quoting Stephen Moore one more time, quote, every study shows that having a job is highly associated with better health, longer life expectancy, happiness, and improvements in family conditions. Children and spouses of someone who is working are better off, end quote, Mr. Moore concludes. Favoring unions. The U.S. Labor Relations Board has pretty much a singular purpose, to support labor unions. When I joined the U.S. workforce about 45 years ago, 33% of my fellow workers belong to unions. It's now about 11%, and over half of those are government employees. The evil of unions in the government sector was more clearly emphasized by the New Dealer himself, FDR, than I can explain it. But how does this harm the poor? Well, unions are that other effect that cause both of the evils of economics, inflation and unemployment. Their clearly stated purpose is to raise the wages of their union members. Well, that's half the definition of inflation, which is increasing wages and prices. And as I pointed out earlier, as a product or service gets more expensive, consumers demand less of it. And as union wages get higher, there's more supply than demand of labor, and that's unemployment. Now, here's how this violates our dicta from 1 Timothy that we referred to about paying the worker his wages. It's because you're paying the worker someone else's wages, not his wages. And it's certainly not a fair wage by any calculation because the union has unfairly increased the wage. Licensing requirements. More than a quarter of the U.S. workforce have jobs that require licenses. These types of jobs are out of the question for the poor unless the individual has the required license. Occupational licensing restrictions cost millions of jobs nationwide and raise consumer expenses by as much as about $203 billion per year. I had a personal friend who was getting his hair cut by an alley-dwelling stylist who just moved to Texas but refused to pay the license fee. Okay, the stylist was not literally working in the alley, but she was, quote, in the shadows of the economy, as people like to say about people who operate without legal status. Licensing drives up the cost of services that are provided under its requirements. Econ 101 tells you that as the price gets higher, less is demanded, and the supplier of the service is harmed. This violates our standard about paying the worker his wages because the worker who gets locked out by licensure requirements has no wage, and the worker who gets licensed pays part of his wage for the license fee. Okay. In Federalist Paper number 51, James Madison wrote, "If men were angels, we would not need government." As I've stated in this podcast, the men who make the governmental laws are also not angels because we assume angels would help, not harm, the poor. I'm Dave Arnott, the Christian Economist. Fear God, tell the truth, earn a profit. See you next time. For more information, please visit us online at davearnott.com. If you have questions or suggestions for future podcasts, please submit them in the comment section below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.